29. The past. Vince sat at the bar, every part of him alert to the crush of people around him, to the smell of sweat and the sweet rot of syrupy drinks sunk down into the grooves of the floor. The music was turned up loud enough to discourage much in the way of conversation, but to the right of him, a guy was trying, shouting at another guy about a video game where you built a house underwater. "That's the whole point," the guy was yelling. "To survive. Build your base. You've got to get ready for when they launch the update and the sharks come." It had been a month and a half since he'd left Salt's house. And every day he was away from the place, he simultaneously hated it more and missed it. He felt homesick for what had never been his home, and for the one person who had mattered to him most and was gone. The hardest part was having so much time to think, to have to make his own decisions, to wrestle with the guilt of being alive when by all rights he shouldn't have been. Vince was used to measuring out his life in small moments, never letting himself look much ahead and never daring to look behind. Here we are, on a boat. Here we are, with a knife. Here we are, in the bedroom of a CFO in the middle of the night. And now Vince had to make plans if he was going to survive. He had something he could use to bring down the old man, but he couldn't use it on his own. Better to pass it off to Night Sing, with his web of connections and his dislike of Salt. The item was in the messenger bag slung across Vince's shoulder, and he wanted nothing more than to be rid of it. Maybe Vince could have a future where he wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder. That thought brought a rush of guilt with it. The problem was that Vince wasn't used to the setting things up part. He'd been all about the execution. "Another?" the bartender asked. Vince had allowed himself to be talked into a pumpkin beer, having no idea what to order in a place like this. Adeline would have had champagne with vodka to wake it up. Salt would have had a single malt from a place that Vince was certain he'd butcher the pronunciation of, and which was likely to dig deeply into his cash reserves. Remy had always had whatever everyone else was having, but Vince didn't have to act like Remy anymore. The pumpkin beer had the virtue of being cheap. Unfortunately, in Vince's opinion, that was its singular virtue. "I think I'll try something else." While the bartender went through what they had on tap and Vince chose something at random, he noticed 2 glow mists walking in. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw them spread out, their gaze sweeping the room, trying to spot someone with the description Vince had given. He supposed that they were attempting to be subtle, allowing their shadows to seem dormant, but Vince clocked them immediately. There was an energy to them, a dark swirling at the edges, like smoke trickling out from hidden hot embers beneath char. Night Sing had promised to meet him alone. He'd lied, which meant that Vince had very probably walked into a trap. He'd chosen this place because it was crowded, and was glad of it now. There couldn't be many other people in the room, if any, without shadows. But so long as he stayed part of the crush at the bar, what he was lacking wouldn't be apparent. Vince was glad he'd only described himself tonight as wearing a red scarf, one which was still resting in his bag, waiting to be put on. He turned to the woman standing beside him. If he was part of a conversation, he'd give the glow mists another reason to overlook him. Around his age, her cheeks were flushed from the warmth of the room. She signaled to the bartender, who seemed to be aggressively ignoring her. Her licorice black hair hung down her back, and a tattoo of scarab beetles formed a collar just beneath her throat. Across the room, one glow mist had positioned himself near the entrance, and another was standing in front of an empty booth. Night must be on his way. Vince raised his hand and somehow caught the bartender's attention. "I think she'd like a drink," he said. The woman flashed him a look he found hard to read. "A gin and tonic," she said. "The cheapest gin you have, with 3 limes." The bartender turned to Vince, and he realized that his second beer was half gone. He didn't remember drinking it. He didn't even remember if he liked it. "Bourbon. Neat," he said, dredging that up from a movie or something. When it came, he learned that neat meant without ice. "I don't usually order god-awful drinks," she told him, squeezing the first of the desiccated and slightly brown limes perched on the side of her glass. "So tonight's special," he said. That got him a quick smile. There and gone. And suddenly, Vince had the terrible certainty that he knew her. He couldn't remember where or under what circumstances, but they'd met before. The crowd surged in, and he put one hand against the bar to brace himself. "You grew up around here?" It was not a particularly clever question, but maybe her answer would help him place her. The woman pushed back her mane of black hair and took a deep swallow of her drink, trying to avoid being shoved off the bar stool by a guy on the other side of her. "Yeah, I'm a local. But I bet you're not." He nodded, tailoring his story to her lead. "Only been in town a few months." She raised her eyebrows. "School?" He shifted position so that he was standing between her and the press of people. Got an elbow in the back for his trouble. Shook his head. "Looking to make a change." "We've got a lot of asparagus." She laughed at his puzzlement. "So much that they call it Hadley grass. There's even a festival. And 3 different asparagus ice creams. That the kind of excitement you're into?" "Sounds about the level I can handle." The funny thing was, it might as well have been true that he wasn't local, for all he'd seen of the towns. "I guess there's an archery school, and a place where you can learn how to swing a broadsword." There was a slight slur to her voice that made him wonder if the flush in her cheeks was as much from liquor as warmth. "In case I want to slay a dragon." Her nails were ragged at the edges, the nail polish chipped from her biting them. "Do you?" A quick glance showed him that Night Sing had arrived. He sat in a booth at the far end of the room. Night's people had positioned themselves in strategic locations so that once they spotted Vince, they could close in and cut him off from the exits. He counted 5. Definitely a setup. Vince eyed the nearby fire door the crowd was trying to press him into. "Want to slay dragons?" he echoed. "I don't want to slay anything." The bartender walked by and dropped a receipt in front of her, and seemed about ready to ask Vince if he wanted another round. She lifted it and eyed the guy. "What's this?" He shrugged. "Your bill?" "Maybe I wanted another drink," she said, ground glass in her voice. "So pay for the last one." He wore an arrogant little smile, aware he ruled the bar. She leaned toward him, her voice loud enough that people waiting for their drinks could hear her. "I've been sitting here, watching you short pour the guests, give people the wrong change, use sour mix instead of lime juice, and wipe down the counter straight into the ice bin," she told him, reaching into her bag and pulling out a handful of coins. "You're going to burn in bartender hell." "You're drunk," he said defensively. "If I am, it's to spite you." She counted out what she owed in quarters and dimes, leaving him as many pennies as she could find at the bottom of her purse. She turned to Vince, and the fire hadn't gone out of her eyes. "You think I'm petty, right?" He thought she was everything Remy had been afraid to be. "I think you're a vigilante," he said, smiling. She contemplated him for a long moment. "Come outside with me," she said. "It's too hot in here." Vince was torn. If he left with her, Knight and his people would be less likely to spot him. Walking beside her, his missing shadow could be easily overlooked. But part of him wondered if Knight had come there expecting to be set up himself. If the Glomist was taking precautions instead of making a move against Vince, then the situation was still salvageable. What he wanted, though, was to go outside with the woman. He got out his wallet and threw down a couple of bills. She took his hand and led him toward the door. He watched the confident sway of her hips. She walked through the bar as though she expected everyone to get the hell out of her way. And amazingly, they did. "I'm Vince," he told her. But her gaze was on Knight Singh, recognition in her expression. Then her gaze slid back to Vince. "Charlie," she said, pointing to herself. "Charlie Hall." Vince had counted 5 Glomists, but that didn't mean Knight hadn't hired people who weren't Glomists. People like Charlie. She might lead him around the back of the bar and sink a knife in his side. And if he was lucky, that was when Knight Singh's people would restrain him and sell him back to Salt. If he wasn't lucky, she'd have orders to finish him off. The cold air of the alley hit his face, and he felt a rush of indifference toward risks. He liked her. He liked that she was mean and funny and willing to make a scene. He liked that she was nothing like him or anyone from his old life. He liked her enough to follow her deeper into the alley, despite his suspicions. When she turned against the brick facade of the building and threw him a look that felt like a dare, he pressed her back against the wall and kissed her. Her lips were chapped. He could smell her perfume, something with smoke and roses in it. Her mouth tasted like gin. Knight Singh could go hang. Vince could make the exchange some other time. Drawing away, he looked down at her, traced the line of scarabs across her collarbone. "Do you want to go somewhere?" He whispered against her hair, although he wasn't sure where that would be. He'd spent the last night in a van. All he knew was that he wanted her. "Here," she said softly, reaching for his belt. He wasn't sure if she actually liked him. Maybe she just wanted to forget whatever sadness she'd come to the bar to drink away. He could make her forget. He concentrated on the hot rush of her breath, the softness of her hip when he lifted her, the scratch of the brick against his palm. He didn't dare think about the past, and he wouldn't let himself think about the future. All he let himself think of was her. 30. Ye Who Enter Here. On Saturday night, Charlie pulled her mother's station wagon to the curb far enough from Salt's house that she didn't think anyone would notice their arrival. Pressing her forehead to the steering wheel, she took a deep breath. Then she turned to her sister in the passenger seat. "You don't have to do this." Posey made a face. "You don't either. At least I'm getting something out of it. I don't know what you're getting." "A preemptive strike," Charlie informed her. She knew Salt was perfectly capable of fulfilling all the worst of his promises. If she didn't get this right, she might not have another chance. Charlie got out of the car. "See you later, alligator," she said, leaning on the door. Posey grinned. "After a while, crocodile." Charlie made her way along the side of the road. backpack slung over one shoulder. The closer she got to Salt's fairy tale castle of a house, the more clearly she remembered the last time she'd been there. The panic she'd felt running through those woods. The cockiness Rand had as they went inside. The churn of her guts. And there she was, years later, about to con her way into a party. Dressed in a scratchy white shirt, cheap black pants, and a vest, looking the picture of a cater waiter. She liked to think Rand would be proud. She'd spent all of Friday getting ready. Abandoning her collection of wigs, she'd gone to the mall and had a recent beauty school graduate give her a pixie cut. It made the back of her neck itch, but she definitely looked different. With that, she added a fresh round of Halloween makeup to cover her bruises and tucked all the supplies she thought she would need into her backpack. The swelling in her face had gone down a bit, and she was almost entirely sure that her rib was okay. She was doing great. Charlie tried to sink into character, resentful and underpaid employee arriving late to a gig to which she already regretted agreeing. It wasn't that hard. As she swung through the open gates, which, she couldn't help notice, were connected to a fence topped with what appeared to be an electric wire, she had almost convinced herself that it wouldn't bother her to see the estate. Then it came into view, and her stomach tried to crawl out of her mouth. Constructed of some gray stone and crawling with Boston ivy turned bright red and gold in the late autumn air, it loomed in the distance. Gargoyles, made of bronze and streaked with verdigris, squatted above the roof, watching her approach. The more she looked, the sharper her memories became. So she turned her gaze to the grass and kept going. Run. You have to run. The people from the palace are hunting me. Charlie had worked enough jobs that she ought to trust the tug of intuition, that antenna inside her attuned to wrongness. There was something she was missing, as though she was looking at dots up close. But if only she could step back, she'd see another pattern. That feeling had kept her from getting caught before. Sometimes you felt the air change and knew to abandon a con. But no matter how wrong this already felt, she was going to see tonight through. A valet watched Charlie in a considering manner as she approached the house. She gave him the long-suffering nod of one person working on a Saturday to another. That seemed good enough to convince him she was staff, and he lost interest. Around the back, Charlie found the kitchen. She'd called around until she discovered someone involved in the party. It turned out that Jose was part of the on-site catering. He'd left the door propped open for her. Inside, cold shrimp were being tweezered onto silver platters topped with lettuce leaves and some kind of creamy sauce. Risotto balls were being lowered into a portable fryer set up on a large marble island big enough to lay out a dead body on. She turned her thoughts away from that. It was easy to be overlooked at a party like this, with multiple vendors and freelance waitstaff. Jose's catering would be supplemented by specialty offerings, like a caviar station, or a sushi station, or a human sacrifice station. Hopefully, she could get lost among them. She was just stepping into the hall when someone called after her. "You're late," said a harried-looking woman with a clipboard and a lot of curly blonde hair, probably the event coordinator. With what Charlie hoped was a sufficiently blank look, she turned. "Sorry, I was looking for a bathroom to use before I started." "There isn't time. Put your things down and take these hors d'oeuvres." Charlie shoved her backpack under a table where she could grab it easily later and took the metal tray. Across the room, she saw Jose, rolling prosciutto roses. He winked. Cheeks prickly with warmth after going from the cold autumn air into rooms full of bodies, Charlie moved through Lionel Salt's mansion. Passing leaves smeared with blue cheese and candied walnuts to anyone with empty hands was a good cover for reacquainting herself with the house and trying to spot Vince. Charlie gritted her teeth against the uncomfortable mix of familiarity and dread she felt as she walked through the rooms. She kept a little smile on her face and didn't meet anyone's eyes. Balthazar had shielded her from direct contact with clients, but stealing things occasionally meant conning people, so it wasn't like no gloom had met her before. She just hoped no one would recognize her. Passing through a gallery-like hall near the entrance, she covertly observed a display of antiquarian books under glass. Beside that was an etched plate that said, "The Lionel Salt Library will be open to all gloamists and cultivate a space where arcane knowledge can be shared." The taxidermied animal heads Charlie remembered looked down from where they hung, their shining glass eyes, polished antlers, and sharp horns catching the light. Usually collections like Salt's were hoarded, so the idea of getting a look must have gotten the glooms, especially the younger ones, salivating. As a thief of magical secrets, Charlie was not unlike a bee, pollinating many flowers. Once gloamists digested an old book, copying down the experiments or techniques they thought might be useful into their own notes, the only reason they hung on to the original copy was to guarantee that what they learned stayed exclusive to them. Charlie had once failed to steal a volume from a guy, because when she arrived, she discovered that he burned every single book he'd acquired as soon as he copied down the parts in which he was interested. She still got angry sometimes, thinking about him. If Salt wanted to found a library, that would make him very popular. It showed a willingness to share his secrets, a generosity of spirit. Or that his secrets were so much greater and more terrible that he could afford to have a collection like this mean nothing to him. Either way, he ought to have no problem convincing the local gloamists that his elevation to the cabal had been long overdue. His influence would grow, and so would the horror that followed in his wake. Charlie's gaze went to her own shadow, then away. At the end of the hall hung an oil painting of a dark-haired woman, lying on a couch wearing a diamond-encrusted crown. Her dress was parted, showing her naked body from the waist down, and suspended over her by straps was a stallion. Charlie frowned at it, then glanced around. It was far from the only piece of disturbing art. A painting of a Roman king being devoured by his horses hung by a door. Beneath a sconce, she spotted a sketch of a decomposing fawn, as though Salt's house needed to be creepier. Charlie walked by massive and magnificent stairs carved in the shapes of lions, through an arch into a sitting room. There, 2 bartenders poured drinks from behind a wooden bar topped in pewter. A small knot of people waited for their drinks. Gangsters stood shoulder to shoulder with academics. Performers chatted with mystics. Gloaming was a new science, and its practitioners as hungry as the shadows that fluttered behind them in the shapes of capes or wrapped around their bodies like snakes. Others drifted a bit behind their wearer, leashed by a single silver cord, moving to peer out of the window or fetch a drink. One shadow even drifted up to her tray, plucking an endive off of it before she could pause. Startled into stopping, she swallowed a curse as she almost dropped the food. she heard a bark of laughter from across the room. A prank. It reminded her that no matter how tense she was, and no matter how terrible her suspicions were, to most of the glooms present, this was a party. With effort, she swallowed her irritation and glanced into the great room, with its towering 2-story ceiling and its wall of windows. She spotted Salt in a tuxedo, standing beside one of his 4 enormous couches, declaiming to a few older gloamists. Adeline, in an elegant black column of a dress, stood beside the limestone fireplace, in which green and blue flames burned. An enormous painting of a forest hung over the mantel. Only when you looked closely did you notice that it was full of shadows wearing deep red slashes for mouths, and that gray body parts had been rendered among the ferns of the forest floor. 2 additional cabal members were there as well. Bellamy stood in a corner, and Malik looked particularly regal. His locks had been pulled into flat twists on the sides, and wrapped in gleaming gold thread, his shadow hanging across his body like a sash. A trio of musicians in animal masks played classical music. An owl with a violin, a fox with a cello, a bear with a viola. Through the windows, an outdoor garden was lit with low lamps that showed off marble statues of shrouded figures. What must it have been like to grow up in a place like this, surrounded by this much wealth, force-fed untold depravity? Charlie finished her circuit and ate the remaining hors d'oeuvres so she had an excuse to go back to the kitchen. Setting the silver tray down on the marble island to be wiped and refilled, she took the opportunity to grab her backpack. Then she headed directly for the library. Charlie's memories of the house were blurry and indistinct, more nightmare than recollection. A voice close enough for her to have felt breath on her neck. Cavernous rooms linked together in a puzzling maze. The library, with a secret door leading to a room of treasures, including a safe. With the rug she vomited on, and where she might have died. When she glanced in, she found 2 men in the leather chairs, talking in an intense way, one gesturing with a snifter of cognac. An empty glass and a napkin rested beside the other. They looked extremely settled. Charlie needed to make them move, and quickly. "Excuse me, sir," she said, squatting down in front of the one she thought seemed more self-important. "I'm sorry, but there was a woman asking for you in the other room. Tall with red hair, very pretty. She described you and told me that if I saw you, I should inform you of her interest." He looked smug and rose. "I'll just be a second," he said to his friend. But his friend was rising too. "Going to refresh my drink," the man said with a little too obvious relief. And Charlie had the sudden thought that perhaps she'd saved him from being buttonholed for the entire evening. Charlie picked up the crumpled napkin and began to sweep up imaginary crumbs until she was alone. Then she went to the light switch on the wall, throwing it so that the darkened room would seem off-limits to other guests. She reached into her backpack and drew on gloves and glasses with tiny lights attached to both sides. Once she switched them on, they would make her face a confusing blur to cameras, as well as provide a way to work in the dark. Finally, she went to the wall of books. Red and gold. Red and gold. Something with flames. Something with a title that started with an I. She couldn't find the lever. 2 pulls of books with red spines and gold type went nowhere. Then she spotted it. A shelf lower than where she'd been looking, and a foot to the left. Inferno. She lifted it, and the bookshelf door swung jerkily inward, revealing the smaller library and the painting with the safe behind. Charlie stepped through into the secret room, its walls covered in shelves packed with older books. Nausea abruptly constricted her throat, the memory of lying on the library carpet rushing back at her as though no time had passed between then and now, as though she were still a terrified kid. The rough texture of the merino wool against her cheek, the wetness from her vomit, the voice coming from the dark. Don't look behind you. The smell of beets still made her gag. Charlie stepped through onto the onyx tiles of the smaller chamber. Shelves lined the walls there too, with older and more precious books filling them. Memoirs, notebooks, and scientific journals, 100 at least, all worth stealing. The mystical discoveries of Teville de Guerre sat beside Confessions of Nigel Lucy, Magus, and Diarios de Juan Pedro Maria Ugarte. There were other books, in Portuguese, Chinese, Arabic, Latin, and Greek, as well as a whole half wall in French. Her fingers itched to choose a few at random and stuff them into her bag. Pushing the bookshelf door closed, she checked for any additional wiring that might indicate an unexpected surprise. Charlie didn't find anything that seemed worrisome and turned toward the back of the hidden room. A trompe-l'oeil of a dead goat, entrails spilling out and mingling with split pomegranates, hung above a club chair, the only piece of furniture. Gingerly, she felt around the edge of the hideous painting. She found hinges, with no lock on the other side. She swung it open to reveal the wall safe she remembered. Made by Stockinger, who were known for offering solid, bespoke models with the bells and whistles of all the custom luxury safe makers like Bubin and Zorweg or Agresti. There would be winders for watches, cloth-lined wooden drawers, but none of the ridiculous golden and bejeweled neo-Victorian extravagances of Boca de Lobo pieces. Stockinger made serious safes for serious people. A dial rested on the front, beside a gleaming handle engraved with Lionel Salt's initials, and beside it, a keypad. Most modern safes were digital, offering none of the romance of breaking into the old ones. None of the listening for when the spin changed, the infinitesimal slotting into place, the softer click-click as satisfying as the crack of knuckles. If she could ignore the keypad entirely, she would. Digital safes weren't just unromantic, they were nearly impossible to open without the code. Taking a deep breath, she reset the lock by spinning clockwise, then started going counterclockwise. She heard the first notch at 5. Then she reset and spun again and again until she had 5 numbers. 2, 4, 5, 63, 7. She was certain of them. She was as sure could be. But what there was no way to know was the order. And 5 numbers meant 5 tumblers, 5 interior wheels, and 120 possible combinations. All she could do then was grind through them, while sweat beaded up at her forehead and in the hollow of her throat. She was conscious of the party going on, of time slipping away, of the possibility that someone might find her. Charlie could hear the moment the fence fell and released the locking mechanism. She let out a long, unsteady breath and turned the lever. It only moved halfway. Then the digital keypad lit, green and bright and blinking. Charlie stared at it in disbelief. This safe wasn't digital or dial. It was both. Her heart rate kicked up and her mouth tasted sour with panic. She had no way to know if there was a timer on entering the code, and she'd be limited in the number of tries. Safes like this offered 3, usually, before locking up and setting off an alarm. Fishing a UV pen light out of the bottom of her backpack, Charlie turned off the lights of her glasses, pushing them up onto her head. Then she shone the pen light onto the keypad. Very few people wiped down their keys after use. The light revealed the grease of fingertips, limiting the number of options for the combination. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The same numbers as the other side. Relieved, she moved to type in the order that had worked on the dial. She stopped herself a moment later, finger hovering over the keypad. There were more markings on the 2 and the 6 than on the other numbers, suggesting they repeated. If that was true, then this was a 7-digit code, at minimum. If cracking a mechanical safe was about understanding the machine, cracking a digital safe was about understanding the person who set it. Would they choose a random number and then hide the combination somewhere they could find it? Or would they pick something less random and therefore more memorable? Lionel Salt was the kind of person who needed to be better than everyone else. With his carved stairs, his awful paintings, and his willingness to murder for his own amusement. Not his birthday, since it would be a reminder of his age and mortality. Not his name and numbers, because even he would know that was too obvious. Perhaps a word, then? Blight? Shadow? Gloaming? She stopped. The key is abandon all hope. Abandon all hope. It used all of the numerically converted letters and used the 6 and 2 4 times each. And Salt would like the idea of giving a clue in the form of the book that opened the secret door, referencing the most famous quote from Dante's Inferno, the one that even Charlie, who'd never read it, knew. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. She bet he felt rather smug about his cleverness. Charlie ignored her racing heart, her sweaty hands and panicked thoughts. She went over the word again, writing it out in numbers in the dust of the onyx floor. 2, 2, 2, 6, 3, 6, 6, 2, 5, 5, 4, 6, 7, 3. Carefully, she punched the code into the still blinking pad. There was a sharp beep, as though an alarm was about to sound. Then she heard the second locking mechanism opening. She turned the lever again. A soft glow came from inside, showing off felt-lined drawers and several shelves of items. Charlie opened one. A small bag of diamonds rested inside. In another, she found an antique pistol chased in gold. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, the thing she'd come looking for. Quickly, she made the exchange, shoving the item deep into the bottom of her backpack, hoping like hell that she knew what she was doing. Then, in the privacy of Salt's hidden room, she got out her party outfit. Susie Lampton, the only person whose closet she had access to at the moment, wasn't even remotely her size. She still had her key to Rapture, though, and there was no better time to borrow that red satin suit abandoned in the back. With a little stretch to the fabric, it fit her like a second skin. Add to that some Notice Me red lipstick, and Charlie would seem like she'd just arrived at the party. instead of robbing it for the better part of an hour. Before she was ready to go out there, she pushed on a 3-finger knuckle ring set with onyx and shoved the onyx dagger she'd gotten from Murray's into her bra. Holstered with a makeshift sheath of duct tape, it would be there if she needed it. She waited for the familiar rush, that pleasurable hit of adrenaline. But it wouldn't come. Charlie turned back to the safe, intending to close it, when she noticed a black button in the upper corner, close to the back. Could there be something behind the safe? A compartment she hadn't opened yet? Come on, Charlie Hall. You don't have to stick your finger in every socket. But that cautious instinct seemed to belong to someone who hadn't already chosen the path of recklessness. She pressed the button. A click came from the shelf to her left. Another bookshelf swung open, revealing a hall, a passageway that must run behind the walls of the house. Taking out her phone, Charlie checked the time. She'd gotten to the house at 6:30. Jose had told her that the party was supposed to go officially until 10, and that there was going to be a champagne toast at 8:30. It was 7:45. Time was tight. Still, Charlie stepped through, into the dark. She switched back on the lights on her glasses. They illuminated something that mixed the architecture of a wine cellar with that of a mausoleum. More tiles of onyx ran across the floor. 2 cells were ahead of her, with a door opposite them. A groove had been carved into the ground, running in front of the bars, the blue line of a glass flame outlining the edge. The air had a faint smell of rot and of incense. Sweat dampened her palms and brow. This was the bad kind of adrenaline. The kind that made her twitchy instead of careful, that made her stomach sour and her hands shaky. This felt like a haunted place. Still, she kept walking. The soft soles of her flats scratched against the floor. The cells were deep enough that Charlie's little lights couldn't pierce the darkness. Along the wall were an assortment of restraints. A rope that had been threaded with onyx beads. A pair of shackles with blue silk padding on the inside. The cloth sewn tightly with rectangular onyx tiles. Above them, a shelf with onyx containment boxes. The door on the opposite side was slightly ajar, flickering colors within. She pushed slowly with her foot and found herself staring at a bank of screens. Surveillance footage of the house. Caterers in the kitchen. Partygoers moving through the rooms. The Hierophant, speaking with Vicereine, seeming completely composed. She peered at him more closely, hoping for some tell. The only thing notable was that he was thinner and more unhealthily pale than ever. In another room, 2 men were making out, one a blurred outline. Was he kissing his own shadow? Someone else's? Charlie couldn't tell. Outside in the garden, 3 men were arguing. One had the other by the shirt, their shadows looming large behind them like the spread plumes of fighting peacocks. Salt was walking through the rooms with purpose, a drink in one hand, looking as though everything was going his way. He glanced up, for a heart-stopping moment, peering directly into the camera. The time in the upper right-hand corner read 7:52. Charlie. Vince's voice came out of the darkness. She whirled around. He was in the cell, standing just behind the bars. Broad-shouldered, hair like old gold. A small smile turning up the corner of his mouth. as familiar as her own heart. "What happened to your eye?" he asked. "Hold on," she said, so relieved at the sight of him that her voice broke. "I can get you out of there." Before Charlie could pick the lock, she had to disable whatever the gas line running along the seam beneath the bars was supposed to do. She guessed it was on some kind of tripwire that would send up a burst of flames when the cell door opened. There had to be a way to turn it off. Charlie hesitated. The wrongness of the scene bothered her, like an itch in the mind. Pale, hollow eyes followed her movements. She wanted to believe it was Vince in the cell, behind bars of onyx, with a gutter of fire between them. But those weren't restraints meant for a human. "You're not Vince, are you?" she asked softly, walking to the bars. The silence from the cell was her answer. Charlie met the Blight's gaze. "You're his shadow. You're red." 31. The Fool, the Magician, and the Hierophant. Only when her back hit the wall did she realize how far she'd moved from the cell. "You found the Liber Noctum," she managed to choke out. "You did the ritual." "Because I look like a person?" the shadow asked. "It was Edmund who made me like this." "He wouldn't do that." Her voice came out too high. She didn't know how to comprehend the being in front of her. It was a doppelganger, a mirror reflection come to life, a thing Frankensteined together from discarded parts of Vince, slime and snails and puppy dog tails. "Is he here? Is Vince all right?" The shadow shrugged. Even its expression was one that Vince would make, slightly chagrined. The tailored suit it wore was the color of its eyes. "We met before. Do you remember?" "Don't look behind you." Charlie didn't speak for a long moment. It wasn't as though the thought hadn't crossed her mind, but she'd had a hard time believing it. "In the library. I suppose you wanted it to be Remy who saved you," the shadow said, voice soft. "Not Red." Charlie wasn't about to answer that. Yes, she had a naive desire for the sort of romance a palm reader would trace on the inside of a hand. A faded love, begun in childhood. Love was a family religion, passed down to her when she'd been too young to protect herself from belief. "Even back then, you were already a Blight?" The shadow nodded, allowing her to turn the subject. "And you killed people for salt." She kept her voice stiff. "Yes," it said. She had to remind both of them that she wasn't some fool who was going to trust it just because they had a weird past together. "Tell me, the way you killed Adam, was that special? Cracking his ribs open like you were going to spatchcock a turkey and painting the walls with his blood? Or is that how you did them all?" It stepped closer to the bars. "Adam? You've got to remember the guy you murdered on my couch, in a very gross way." The shadow stared at her with what appeared to be real horror. "I'd never do that to you. Never." Charlie hated how much it looked like Vince, and how much that made her want to trust it. "Okay, tell me about all the other people you didn't murder." "You're clever," it said, with a small, rueful smile. "And I'm not used to explaining things. I didn't do much talking before. I don't think I'm very good at it." "Try," Charlie said. "You shouldn't have had to come back here." It seemed sad and tired. She had no way to know if that was something it was putting on, or if flesh conferred weakness. You should go and never come back, like I told you that night. So, what? I'm supposed to grab my sister and mother and blow town? Let Salt win? Do whatever he wants to Vince? Yes, it said, with more heat than she expected. He can handle himself. He shouldn't have to, Charlie said. He left you, the shadow said. And you as well, didn't he? Charlie asked. Must piss you off. To have him create you and then shed you like he was crawling out of a chrysalis, leave you behind. Red looked at her with Vince's eyes, but there was a little amusement in them. I'm made of his anger. What do you think? I don't know, Charlie said, refusing to be distracted. I don't know anything about you. The shadow turned its face from her, the amusement gone. I was always the part of him that took care of things when he wasn't able to manage. I was given everything that made him uncomfortable. The desire to cause pain, the terror at what Salt made us do. The ability to intuit how other people felt when the bad stuff happened. I was made to be strong, so he didn't have to be. So yes, I was angry when he was gone. But I loved Remy, no matter what he did, and no matter what he made me do. A shiver went through Charlie's shoulders. Red went on. He wanted to block out what was happening when I was on his grandfather's missions, so I asked him to try untethering me. We didn't understand about blights then. All we knew was that it worked. Each time I returned to him, I was stronger than before, more solid and for longer. We hid it from Salt, he said. Adeline knew, but she kept our secret. Because she and Vince were close, Charlie offered. His lashes brushed his cheek as he looked down and away. We all three were, once. Too close, maybe. We only had each other. It came to her, one of the things she'd heard that night. The boy's voice. He doesn't like you. And then the girl. That's not true. We have games we play that he would never play with you. There was something bad there, lurking beneath the surface, but Charlie was too much a coward to ask. She glanced into the room with the monitors. On the screens, Charlie could see that speeches were underway. She was running late. Where's Vince? Charlie asked. The shadow stared back at her with Vince's pale eyes, and she could feel the hair on the back of her neck begin to stand. The itch of wrongness was back, worse than ever. I know this house, Red said. I could help you get out without anyone knowing you were ever here. Not without Vince, Charlie said. You say you care about him. Help me save him. Help me find him. I'd do anything for you, Char, he told her. But don't ask me for that. There was only one person who called her Char. No. You're not him. Stop acting like him. Char, he cautioned. Where is he? She demanded, heart thundering. You already know, he said. She didn't want to put the pieces together. Vince had snapped Hermes' neck and gotten rid of the body. He cleaned up crime scenes awash in blood for a living. None of that sounded like Remy. But it sounded a lot like Red. Vince faked his death, Charlie protested. Or Salt faked it for him. He was on the run, and 2 days ago he was in a hotel room. The shadow didn't speak. It was hard to fake a death. There were dental records. There was evidence of past surgeries or fractures. Forensics could tell a lot from bones, sex, ancestry, age, height. Salt could have paid someone, or several someones, to cover all that up. There was another answer, though. That the burnt body found in the car had belonged to Edmund Carver. And the person she had known wasn't him at all. The shadow wasn't a malevolent entity taking the shape of Vince. It was Vince. He was Vince. And Vince had always only been the lost parts of Edmund Carver. The scraps from his table, his upside-down self, his mirror self, his night self. He was right. Part of her had known from the moment he'd been horrified about Adam. She hadn't wanted to admit it to herself. Charlie Hall, flinching, finally discovering the puzzle she hadn't wanted to solve. When Remy was dying, Vince said, after his grandfather stabbed him, while Adeline screamed, Remy grabbed hold of me and pulled me to him, so I would have all his blood, all his strength. As it left him, it became mine. He breathed his last breath into my mouth. For a moment, I didn't understand how I could be naked, how I could feel the cold floor under me. Then I ran. Hours later, I woke up beneath an underpass, lying on asphalt and broken glass with no idea how I got there. And then I had to learn how to be a person, all the time. I tried to be, for you. Charlie recalled his words during their last fight, their only real fight. I wish I could say I was sorry, that I wanted to be honest the whole time, but I didn't. I never wanted to be honest. I just wanted what I told you to be the truth. If this was what was behind the mask, she understood why he hadn't wanted to remove it. And called yourself Vincent, Charlie said. The one thing Remy didn't give me that I took anyway, the shadow said, lifting his chin as if daring her to judge him for it. Down the hall, gears shifted in the wall, making a soft but distinct noise. Someone had entered the secret room beyond the library. In moments, they'd enter the corridor where Charlie was standing. Vince, she said. Their eyes met. Hide, he told her. Charlie made it to the shadows of the security room, crawling under the leather couch at the same time she heard steps in the hall. How many times had Salt sat on that couch, watching something awful on the screens? Rand might have died in one of these cells. Charlie herself could have died there. Could still, if she wasn't careful. Red. A woman's voice, soft and worried. Adeline, Charlie realized. He didn't tell me you were here until now. Did he hurt you? Only silence answered her. I know. I should have left when you did, she said, with a big huffing sigh. You must be very angry with me. Vince's voice had a veneer of calm, but beneath you could hear the vibration of some very different emotion. Once his mother was dead, he wasn't going to rest until the world knew what your father had done. You should have warned him she was in danger. I didn't know. How could I have known she was going to overdose? I thought she was getting better. We all did. You know why she never got better, Vince said. Your father needed her to be sick, and then he needed her to be dead. Vince sounded as though he was talking about a family that wasn't also his. His mother, your father. The only person he considered to be his family was Remy. I swear I didn't know about any of it, she protested. The hall was dark, and Charlie thought it might be possible to slip out past Adeline while she was distracted. Quietly, she pulled herself out from under the couch. But as she edged closer to the door, Charlie's whole plan started to seem wobbly. Maybe she should bonk Adeline over the head and try to get Vince out of the prison. But if Adeline didn't have the key, and neither Adeline nor Vince were behaving as though there was a possibility of her freeing him, then they were all screwed. Carefully, Charlie slid behind Adeline's body, moving slowly and sticking to the shadows. You can still help me. Vince's voice was soft. He didn't look in Charlie's direction, but there was something so carefully blank in his stare that the effort showed. Adeline put her hand on one of the onyx bars of his prison. How? Charlie was far enough down the hall by then that she didn't hear Vince's request. Maybe it was unfair to think he couldn't trust Adeline as far as he could throw her. If Charlie's plan worked, it wouldn't matter. She'd come back with a hammer and a flame-retardant blanket and get him out. She would, even if she was afraid of him. Sliding the door open, Charlie slipped through. Then she climbed back through the second hidden bookcase into the library. She needed to get outside and meet Posey, but she was distracted, thinking of how he'd guided her through the house that night. Don't look. What would she have seen if she had, back then? Perhaps a smudgy shape, like a ghost? Perhaps he would have been half boy and half shadow. Don't look at me. She snuck into a garden room. Ominously large plants with waxy leaves filled the spaces between pieces of white cast iron furniture. Through the windows, she could see the gardens. Charlie took out her phone and sent a text. The time on her screen read 8:16. 14 minutes to do what she needed to do, and no chance for errors. But she had at least one answer she hadn't before. If Red wasn't the blight that Salt had been using to do his dirty work, she knew who had been in his employ. Opening a multi-paned glass door halfway, she slipped through into the cold night air. Posey met her on the side of the house, breathing hard. I made it. She looked wide-eyed with panic. You're still sure? Charlie asked her sister. You're the one who has to be sure, Posey told her, although she was obviously nervous and not just about getting caught. We can still walk away. Walk away. Wasn't that what she'd tried to do for years? Walked away from the death of Rand, pretended it hadn't scarred her, pretended she didn't remember, that she didn't blame herself for surviving. Walked away from being a thief and told herself it was because of the bullet in her side that she'd lost her nerve, rather than admit she'd scared herself with how easily and brutally she'd turned the betrayal back on Mark. She'd never been all that afraid of getting hurt or dying. It had always been her own abilities, her capacity for solving a puzzle, for getting a job done at any cost. She was terrified of what she could do if she tried. From the time she'd pretended to channel Alonzo and had actually gotten rid of Travis, she'd been afraid of herself. Somebody needed to keep her in check, and so that person became Charlie herself, making sure she got knocked down every time things were going too well, picking the wrong people to love, getting fired from jobs, screwing up. Charlie had been walking away from herself her whole life. She sat down on the grass. Posey sat down opposite her, their feet touching. Charlie took the onyx dagger from its sheath. "Ready?" she asked. Posey nodded. Charlie wasn't sure what she expected, but the first cut didn't feel like anything. The real challenges were spotty moonlight and inexperience, and she was relieved when her part was done and Posey took over. Inside the house, she watched Salt move to the front of the great room. He had a champagne flute in one hand. This must be the part where he thanked them all for coming, and the cabal for accepting him as a member. Charlie staggered to her feet, not quite sure how she felt. Not lighter, not less herself, but changed. Maybe there really was such a thing as fate. Maybe people really did have destinies that could be deciphered through cards. Maybe Charlie needed to stop fighting hers. With a last look back at Posey, she opened one of the glass doors to the great room. A great gust of cold wind whipped through the room behind her, filling the long white curtains like sails. Conversations went out like candles as the glow-mists turned toward her. She hadn't expected to make quite so dramatic an entrance. Charlie stuck close to the doors, making sure the light was coming toward her. "Hello," she said, her voice carrying in the high-ceilinged room and remaining steady, despite all the eyes on her. "Sorry, I'm late." "Charlie Hall," Lionel Salt said, furious at the interruption and doing a bad job of hiding it. "I didn't expect you'd make it." Tension straightened her spine, drawing back her shoulders. She was certain he'd been counting on her not showing up. After all, he'd given her a terrifying threat and then set her a task at which she'd been guaranteed to fail. The last place she ought to be was at his party. The smart thing to do would be to leave town for a couple of weeks until things cooled off. Maybe not come back. But of course, whatever kind of smart Charlie was, it wasn't that kind. "You told me what would happen if I didn't." A few hushed conversations became less hushed after that. Gossip was the lifeblood of any party. A musician, the one in the owl mask, made for the exit, instrument in hand. A waiter whispered to Jose. The waiter pointed. Jose took a canapé off a silver tray and ate it. This was definitely not going to help her reputation back home. Across the room, the Hierophant left where he'd been standing and began to move toward her. His eyes were more sunken than ever. His lips had a faintly blue cast. "I would think that this was a piece of performance art for our entertainment, except that Lionel seems absolutely flummoxed," said Vicereine. The head of the Alterationists was in a tuxedo, her shadow taking on the appearance of a large hunting cat pawing the ground beside her. "Maybe you missed your cue?" Salt cleared his throat. "I hired her to steal back a book that I lost, the Liber Noctem. It is a jewel in my collection, and I had hoped to have it on display tonight." "So, Miss Hall, do you have my book?" "I do," she said. He smiled at that, with all the satisfaction of someone checkmating a rogue king. "Well then, come and give it to me." He had, after all, arranged a situation where all her choices were bad. The only book she had was the one that had belonged to Night Singh. She could bluff and give him that. He'd probably appreciate having it, since the cover was stuffed with pages full of heinous shit he'd done. But no matter if she gave him something valuable, he'd still accuse her of foul play, of trying to pass off that book as his lost one. Charlie took a deep breath, letting Salt really enjoy the moment. Then she reached into her backpack and took out what she'd brought from the safe in the library, where it had been locked up tight the whole time. The famed Book of Night, the genuine Liber Noctum. Light streaming through the crystals of the chandelier reflected off the polished metal cover, sending rainbows along the wall. The smile left Salt's face so quickly that it seemed as though it had been slapped off. "Where did you find?" "I stole it," Charlie said. "That's what I do. You told me to get it, so I got it." The Hierophant reached for the book with pale, trembling fingers. "Mine! Those secrets belong to me."